a introduction to the interface for TouchDesigner. In this one, we're going to actually start building some networks. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select all of these objects and delete them. So to do that, what you need to do is you have one object selected, right? That's the one that's in green. So select any one of these objects, it doesn't matter, operators. And then if you hold down Shift and you click and drag, the rest of those in the network are going to be highlighted in yellow. And I can just hit delete to get rid of all of that because I don't need any of those default operators. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a couple ways we get files or sources in, and we're going to be specifically in this first part of the tutorial, we're going to focus on video or still images. And then we are going to be able to switch between those, and we'll look at how to do that. And we're kind of build a network and show how both source input works and then how we can continue on down the chain and make something that's actually interactive with a very small number of operators. Okay, so we need to get files in. There's a couple ways we can do that. The first way is you can navigate to your Finder if you're on the Mac, or Explorer if you're in Windows. And I believe you can just click and drag anything in here and drop it, and it will create a movie file in Operator. Now this will work for images, right? Notice that this is not a movie, this is a static image of a galactic being megastructure. And then there's like, this is actually part one of this tutorial that's an MOV file, which I can also drag in, and it will create the exact same movie file in. Right, so that's one way to do it. It's really actually kind of nice to be able to just pull these things in, and you can actually see the video and moving. Now, there's no sound on these, right? The sound is, completely cut off. This is just a video source. And we'll look at how we can bring audio in as well in a bit, but we're going to just be focusing on images for now. So I might look for a better video, but this will work for the time being. Okay. So we've got these two different sources coming in. So let's look at the other way we can do this just so we have a sense. So because I'm not so fond of this video file, I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. So instead of just dragging and dropping things in here, I can also double click in the background. And you'll see I have all of these possible operators I can use that are tops, right? The purple ones are all for video and images. Anything that's got red, green, and blue channels is something that we can manipulate with a top. So the way that we can find the one we're looking for is there's a search bar at the top, and automatically the cursor's already in it. So if I know I'm looking for a movie file in, I can just type MOV, and it's going to gray out everything except the things that have that option. And so we don't want a movie file out, we want a movie file in, so we're going to go ahead and click on that. And then you get this gray box, and I can just drop this wherever I want it to go on the screen. And this is their default image. And what I want you to note about this, and we may just go ahead and use the banana for the time being. It's not a video file, it's just a single frame, but it has transparency, right? If we come up, and what I want you to note is when we have it here, if we come up here, you'll see there's this path here. If I click on the text, I get this entire thing. And so this is a TIFF file, a banana, and it's in this samples folder, blah, blah, blah. We don't care about any of that. Unless we're writing code to manipulate this, we don't need to worry about it. But if we hit this plus sign, we can go ahead and use this as a way to load things as well, right? So if I was like, oh, I'd really, maybe I want this butterfly instead. Maybe this one, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Right, I could put a butterfly in there. In their default folder, they actually have, I think they have some videos in here too. I can't remember if this is just images. It's under map. There might be a, let's see here. There might be a movie folder. There's not. I thought there was one in, I thought there was a movie in here. I'm just maybe totally losing my mind. Ah, there's count.mov, there it is. So if I go ahead and open this up, right, now it's automatically playing and everything is good. And I want you to note, right, with these other settings here, we can We can play it sequentially. We can lock it to a timeline. We can specify the index. We're not going to worry about any of those right now. If I want it to stop playing, I can turn it off by clicking on this. If I want to adjust the speed, I can slow this down substantially, right? So it's going like really, really slow. Even though my slider goes up to 1 here, I can also set this to 2, right? Or 4 or 8 or 100 or whatever we wanted to do. I don't want to go too high because that's a little bit flickery for people that have epilepsy, right? So we can do that. Queuing basically is saying, where do you want this to start, right? What point in this video do you want it to start? Now, sometimes, right, if you're using like a long video, you might want to just grab, you might have like a certain scene that comes on, and that's where you want to start grabbing this from, right? And so if I was to do this, this is a percentage. You can also say frames or seconds. Index is just like, sort of like frame number. But seconds, right, if you're like, if you know that it starts at like 34 seconds in, you could do this in seconds instead. So if I set this here and then I pulse my cue, right, it's going to reset it to wherever that frame is. So you can see every time I click it, it's popping either forward or backward in time to align with my cue. This can be really useful if you're looping something in time with music. I'm going to go ahead and change this to back to index, right? And you can kind of see my indexes from 0 to 1, right? We're just going to leave the cue point at 0 for now. So now on the video, let's go ahead and look at what this loop crossfade does, right? So you're going to see that it's kind of, that I have it set somewhere here in the middle. And you'll notice that there's 2 sets of numbers here if I zoom in a little bit further, right? What's happening is it's essentially blending the loop points on this a little bit, and we're getting like a softer transition. If I stop this for the time being, so I can crank, I'm going to crank this all the way up to half, and then we'll start it again. So you can see, right, I've got these 2 edges now coming through, and that's because I'm, right, fading that loop. Sometimes that's nice if it's a really abrupt change and you're trying to loop something and you want it to soften it some, you can use this to do that. One of the other things is step size. So instead of just choosing the speed, I can actually say I want to go forward, 3 frames every frame, right? And so you can get this kind of more jittery look. I'm going to drop that down to 0 again, right? But so it's similar to doing other things, but it just, right, creates more of like a static thing rather than just trying to speed it up and smear it. It's just a little bit different. Audio loop, fade, silence, match to start, right? We don't have audio on here. There's some other settings here on the image tab. Most of the time we don't need those. Trim, if we turn trim on, we can actually, right, cut this down so the loop is shorter just by default. So if I take this in percentage and I was to say, right, this goes from 0 to 100, if I go down to like 44, it should now go from 0 to about 44, right? So, so that's one of the other things that can be useful, because if you are using a longer source, you can just be like, no, this is the only part that I actually care about. And then you don't have to worry about setting your loop points in the similar way, or at least you can trim off after you want the loop to end. Okay, so that's how we get files in. Now there's one other source that we all should, well, most of us should have access to on our computers, and that's a webcam, and or what we would call a video stream. So if I double click, off in space again, and we could either search for it up here, but because it's near the end of the list, we can do this here. So first, right, we have our video device in. That's what we want. We click on this, we click here. And if you have a webcam attached, you can see yourself with your brand new reading glasses that still have the the sticker on them. And so, right, so we can use the webcam on our camera. Now, depending on if it's like a USB cam that you've plugged in, if you have multiple web cameras, if you did have multiple, they'd show up here. the drivers, there's a couple different drivers. Windows typically uses the WDM driver, but you can see there's a bunch of different possible cameras and other video cards that we can use to have our video in, right? Blackmagic makes things where you can basically take like output from like an analog video editing system and feed it in, or output from some other video source and actually bring it in as a video input. And other projects do that as well. And Fleur does heat sensing cameras. Okay, so, right, but this works by default as it does. We do have a couple other interesting options. There is video stream in, which we're not going to worry about right now, but basically if you have a video source on the network, you can pull in video that way. The other thing you can do is a web render, but it basically like creates a browser. It uses Chromium, and you can like actually open browser pages and like YouTube and all of that in this web browser, and then feed that into your patch as well. But we're not going to worry about that right now. So let's look at how we switch between these and how we get them to come out. So let's go ahead and, surprisingly enough, if you want to switch between video sources, you use a switch. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to type in SW, and that's going to gray out everything except switch. Now I've got my switch, and you'll see there's this kind of wider gap here. That means that there's multiple inputs I can put in here, right? So I'm going to take this ABP, this image first. I'm going to take my movie file in and drag that over here too. And now I have these two sources. Now if I click on my switch and have it selected, you'll see there's this index, and the index actually goes from 0 to 10, right? And what it does is it's, this is 0 and this is 1, right? So I could have far more input sources feeding in here, right? Like if I did the video device in again and had my webcam here, I can also feed that in. And then if I go to my switch, I can go here on my index and I can scroll forward, and you'll note as I get past 1, it's going to switch here, and then as I get past 2, right, it switches to me. And you'll notice that right now there's no blending. It's just either on or off. Even though this is a slider and it's a floating point number, it basically is looking for a 0, 1, 2, whatever, right? Because that's what these values are here. You can see these are my input values. If I want to switch the order, I can just click the up arrow here on, say, movie file in, and that will make it the 0th operator, or I can switch it back, whatever. I can bump this up too, right? So the video in becomes the first one. And this is more of an organizational thing. And it would depend on like what you're doing to it and where you want these things to be. If you turn blend between inputs on, this works as like a cross dissolve. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on my patch so you can kind of see this a little bit better. So if I click and drag now, right, I'm slowly getting changes. Now I want you to note that my face is smushed, right? And so, and then when I get all the way into this, this video source, now it's letterbox, right? And then we come over here and it stays letterbox. So this is one of the things where we actually need to use one of these other tabs, the common tab. And this is something that we have to determine how we want to do this. So there are multiple issues with this, and really, ideally, if possible, it would be great if all of your sources were just the same format, right? If you have a lot of letterbox style, like 16:9. Aspect ratio stuff here, it would probably be best if you could have all of it be that way. You can also just define an output resolution. And so you can come down here and you can say custom resolution. And if I set this, I'm just going to leave it at 256 by 256. If I go ahead and blend this now, right, I'm still getting this switching of, right, orientation. It's just lowering my resolution. So I'm going to say use input, but then my output, right, my output aspect ratio is something where this is why it's switching all the time. So if I switched my custom aspect and I said, and I wanted it to be 16 by 9, right now it's 1 by 1. And so if I come over here and click, right, I have a few base options. So let's say 16 by 9, right? You can see the bean is all stretched out now. But these but everything looks smoother because, right, we're not popping between those two different aspect ratios. And so that's something where it's a little bit of prep when you're bringing assets in. You could potentially, there is an operator that would also potentially be able to add like change your aspect ratio for the image and basically keep it centered. And we're not going to worry about that right now, but that is an option as well. But ideally, you just like do this ahead of time. And then when you're working with different assets, you just make sure they're the same aspect ratio. Okay, so we've got our switch. All right, we can switch between 3 different possible inputs. And let's see how do we want to go from here? So let's go ahead and make our output operator. So we're going to double click out in space, and we're just going to type in OUT, and there's out. We're going to select this one and put it here. So this would be the end of our network, right? This is what's going to be output to the screen. If we go to this up here to perform mode, this little up arrow here, right? That's the video source that we're seeing is this, this beautiful bean. Now remember, if we hit escape, that brings us back into this other viewing mode, right? And remember, we can always, right, create a, right, we can actually see this in the background as well if we want to do that, if it makes sense for what we're trying to do. Okay, so what else do we need to do here? Let's see. We've got our switch. So how do we, rather than just like, right, having to click on our operator in order to slide between these values, it would be great if there was a way that we could actually have a slider out here that would allow us to do that. So let's go ahead and make that slider. So a slider is pretty simple. You just double click, and instead of being one of these purple or green operators, what it is, so it's under comp. And under comp, it's under the panels option, which is the second one. And we just go down and go to slider. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this here. And now, right, at this point, I can't move the slider at all, right? I'm moving the actual operator, not this value. But if I click on that little viewer active star, right, then I can slide this value back and forth, which is pretty great. Now, the big question is, how do I get the output of this into this in a way that's going to make it so that I can actually use this to manipulate this input? And so there's a couple of ways that we can do that. But okay, so to do that, I can do that in a couple of ways. And there's one that is the most, hold on a second. Now with the slider, right, I can't just take the output of this and put it in here and have it work, right? It doesn't even let me connect it. So I need a way to get the output of this slider into specifically the index value here. So it's going to take a couple of steps. Most operators are not going to require this additional step. You can actually click this viewer active and you can actually grab whatever channel your value you want and bring it in here. But in this case, I don't think we can do that. Let me see if this works. Yeah, you'll see, even if I dragged it in the way that I just did, I'm getting this error, right? It's not working the way that I would like it to. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. What I need to do is I need another operator that will allow me to grab the value and pull it out. And so if you just need an operator that all it does is basically show the values that you are getting out, it's a null operator. So if I double click, and now I don't want a purple null, right? I don't want the top null, I want a chop null. So I go to chop, I type in NU, and null is here. I'm going to bring this out, connect these two together, and you'll see now I see this value, right? If I make this viewer active, now when I drag the slider, you can see that that value is changing from 0 to 1. And so now what I can do is I can go to my switch, I can click viewer active on my null, and you'll note that now when I hover over this, I get this up arrow and it highlights in green. If I click drag this over to the index on my switch, right, I want to make sure my switch is highlighted in green. If I click drag this over here and drop it into this field, what I want to do is I want to say chop reference. And you can see already the difference down here on my switch, and I can actually, go to this mode so you can see the difference. And so now if I scroll this down, right, you'll see that it's actually allowing me to do this gentle fade. Now the issue is, right, I'm only fading between two sources because my slider only allows me to go from 0 to 1. And what I would like to be able to do is go from, right, at least 0 to 2, if not more, if I wanted to be able to go through even additional sources, right? So how do we make this go from something other than just 0 to 1? The way we do that is we need one more operator. So I'm going to turn the viewer active off on this. I'm going to go ahead and hide this because it makes it harder to see. And what we're going to do is we are going to create an operator called math. And again, this is going to be a green operator. It's going to be a chop because we're just dealing with one value, right? Whereas tops deal with 3 values at a time, possibly 4 because of opacity. So what I need is math. So I'm going to type in math. There it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed the output of my null into the input of my math. And then in my math, I'm going to have that selected. And I'm going to go to this mult add tab. And in the mult add tab, I need to either multiply this by something, right? I can add something to it beforehand. I can add something to it afterward. We're not going to worry about that quite yet. All we need to do is multiply. And what we want to do is we're going to want to multiply it by whatever value it is that's the final value that we want, right? Basically, we want this to be 2. Okay, so I've set this to 2, and I can now slide my slider from 0 up to 2. If I wanted to go to 10, I can type in 10. And now I can go through here, and slide between 0 and 10. Right? It works really well. If for some reason I wanted to go from 1 to 11, I could add 1 here, right? So now now 1 is my minimum value and 11 is my maximum value. Right, that's kind of how these things work together. And the reason there's pre and post is just because certain things get weird. And there's certain reasons why you would want to add beforehand or add afterwards that are context specific. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to update our switch, right? Currently our switch is reading from our null. We actually want to be reading from our math. So I'm going to select the math. I'm going to select my switch. I'm going to turn viewer active on in my math. I'm going to click and drag this into this box up here, and I'm going to say chop reference, right? And now, right, I did leave the math set to 10, I think, so maybe we should select this, change this back to 2 so it actually fits our 3 sources, and then we can do this, right? And so, we have 3 sources, and in computers, things tend to start counting at 0 and then 1, 2, so that's a total of 3, right? And so now we can use this slider to fade back and forth between these things, which is pretty great. So let's say that we want to automate this instead, all right? So this is one option. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move some of these things around. So I'm going to go ahead and click off of this, so it's not active anymore. And I'm just going to click and drag in the background, right? But I can't do that. That's what I'd like to do, right? Just clicking and dragging is going to move this context around. If I hold down Shift, however, and click and drag, right, then I can select those three things. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull these up a little bit so they're out of the way, right? Okay. So now let's say we want to automate this. So there's a lot of ways that we can do automation, right? There's really three primary operators that allow us to do automation over time. And so the first one we're going to look at is just called an LFO. So if I double click here, and I know it's right here, but if you just type LF into the thing, it's going to show you this, and we can click on this, and let's drop it in. And so already you can see what an LFO is doing, right? An LFO, all that stands for is low frequency oscillator. And the reason they call this a low frequency oscillator is because anything that generates like a synth sound is a high frequency oscillator, right? They don't typically call it that, but that's what it is. It's a very short, sub-second rate oscillator, whereas this oscillator pretty much ends, you can't really go, you can go quick with it, right? This is, 8 times a second, right? Default frequency is 1 hertz, which is 1 time a second. But usually this is meant to do, right, slower changes. And you'll see that, right, it's going positive and negative. And currently the type we have it set to is a sine wave. There's also Gaussian, which is similar, but it's just on one side of zero, right? It's all positive values. There's also triangle, right, which is like a sine wave, except that it's linear. So the difference between triangle and sine is hard to see in the way that we're looking at it right now. If we use a different operator, we can actually see what this looks like over time. So if I double click and I go over here to trail, and I just connect this into the very top inlet, you'll see that this is a sine wave. And if I was to select my LFO and adjust my frequency, right, if I lower the frequency, you're going to see, oh, it's at 0. If I set it to 0.1, there we go, right? You're going to see that I get like a much slower, and this will eventually even out. We could do grow length. That might help a little bit. Yeah, there we go, right? So you can see this is a sine wave, right? It's got that curve. It slows down as it reaches the peaks. If I was to increase the frequency here, you can kind of see, right, those changes. Let's go back down to close to 0 so we can really see what's going on. If I go to Gaussian, you're going to see that what that's doing is, right, it's basically doing a sine wave, but it's stopping at 0. Right, so you can kind of see how that looks. If I switch this to triangle, what this is going to do is it's basically going to act like a sine wave, except it's linear, right? There's no curve at the top. It's just like a straight line. The values can increase until they hit the peak, and then they decrease until they hit the valley, all right? And then there's also ramp. And what ramp does is ramp basically increases continually, and maybe I'll increase the frequency a little bit on this to 0.3. So we can kind of see what's going on here, right? But it goes up and then it snaps, and it's hard to see here, but it snaps straight down to 0, right? Square is either on or off. It's either -1 or 1. And you can see how that works. It's just instantaneously switching on and off. This is great for literally turning things on and off. Pulse is a little different. It's like a square wave, except it shoots just a tiny, tiny thing, and it's actually kind of hard to see, and it doesn't go down to -1. It's like half a square wave, but it also doesn't really have a width. It's just sending out a pulse every so often. And then, So those are our different options. So we can also do some other things here. I'm going to go ahead and go back to sine so we can kind of see this a little better. And I'm going to see if I can like reset this. There we go. Okay, so we're starting to get our sine wave, and let's see what we can do here. If we adjust the offset, what that's going to do is it's going to, right, essentially allow us to raise or lower our sine wave so that maybe, right, we're getting all the values are below 0 or they're a little bit above 0. You can offset it a lot. We're going to leave that set at 0 right now, so it's where it should be. And then amplitude is going to allow us, similar to math, it allows us to increase our range, right? So amplitude of 1, it's going to go from -1 to 1. Amplitude of 2, it should go from 2 to -2 or -2 to 2, whichever way you want to think about it, right? So you can see that it's going up and down between those two values. We can set this amplitude to anything, and then, like more or less. And then just as a heads up, the phase here allows you to offset where this wave starts. So if I turn off, if I reset this and I turn off grow length, right, basically it's going to give us our wave here. And what, let's see here, let's see if I can, we're not going to resample that. Basically what it does is, if I go ahead and turn this off, there we go. What offset, or what phase does is it basically says, instead of starting at 0, if I put this right here in the middle, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember, it's going to start the wave here and then go down and up, and it'll be exactly the same. It's just out of phase is what they call it. And for audio, this makes a lot of sense. And then also, if we were trying to use this to control position of something on the screen, we can use, like if we had one wave for the X value set at 0 and the phase of the Y value set at 1, or 0.5 probably, then what happens is you could make, like, you could have something actually be going in circles on the screen, right? There's a lot of uses for offset phase that we don't need to worry about right now, but that's a thing. Okay, so we've got our LFO now, right? What I said is we do want the amplitude to be 2, but let's say we want this to be a Gaussian, right? Because we want it to only go from 0 to 2. We don't want it to go anywhere else. So then to use this value in our switch, we do the same thing that we did before. We're going to make the viewer active for our LFO. We're going to make sure we have our switch selected. And we're just going to click and drag this value into our index, and we're going to say chop reference. And now you can see down below where our output and things are. We are getting this automatic sliding between our different video sources, or our input sources. If I turn this off, we're going to see that we will get snapping between these different options. And it looks like I'm only getting 2 because, right, this is actually not quite making it to 2. So that's something to note, right, with the LFO, is that it's getting close to 2, but it's not quite getting there. So I might want to make my amplitude like 2.1, or if I want it to stay on screen for a bit, maybe I make it 3, right? So that now, right, that third one will actually stay on screen for just a little bit of time, right? And I could adjust, I could also adjust my frequency. I'm going to go ahead and select this switch and make this blend again. Right, but I could also, I can, right, continue to slow this down so I have, right, an even slower rate. I could speed it up some so it's a much faster transition between the two. It really depends on what you're looking for, right? I have this set to really low, so it's a nice slow transition at this point. Okay, so this tutorial has shown how we can do some types of interaction. And how we can actually bridge the output from one of the chops into one of the tops. Now, there's other ways we can actually take a value out of a top, right, and make it out of a chop and make it a top, right? Like in the example that patch that's or network that is there when you open a new project in TouchDesigner, right? They actually took the noise and they fed it in and turned it into something that could be used in as a video source, right? And that's not necessarily what we're interested in doing right now. We're just interested in controlling the parameters of one of our video sources with an LFO. So let's see where else we can do that before we end this tutorial. Let's say we want to adjust the rate of playback of our movie file, right? So let's go ahead and we have our movie file selected. Let's go to play, right? And if we see here, we've got our speed. And our speed, let's say we do want to just vary it from 0 to 1, right? And that's what we're interested in doing. And let's say we want to be able to do that with a slider. So in this case, right, just like we did before, we can come over here, we can select our movie file in, we can use the viewer active, and then we can just click and drag this value into the speed value. And I can say chop reference. And I want you to note, this hasn't opened up in the other windows yet, but you'll see that this is the code that when we do this dragging and dropping of this value into here, this is the code that gets generated for that. Op means like, hey, I'm taking this from an operator. Null1 is the name of the operator that it's taking it from. And V1 is the value, right, the channel or value that is being output. Okay, and so let's go ahead and lock this or make the viewer active. And now, right, you can see if I make this bigger, you can see that as I slide this, I'm adjusting this value. You'll also note that over time, my switch should be fading. There we go, right? So we are getting this fade. If I click here, we can see both of these at the same time.